Hello everyone, my name's John Reardon and welcome to NWR TV. If you follow me on Twitter, you may have seen me share some things from Rise Race the Future. It's a futuristic rally racer coming to Switch next week, and I've been having a great time playing it for review. As soon as I started it up, I was very impressed with it on a technical level, which is really no surprise, as this game comes to us from VD Dev, whose work you may be familiar with from the very technically impressive Ironfall on Nintendo 3DS. Now, Rise Race the Future is not a Switch exclusive, it's already out on PC, and is releasing on Xbox One and PS4 as well. So I reached out to VD Dev, who were kind enough to provide us with the PC version in addition to the Switch version, for the sake of this video. So what you're seeing here is the Switch docked on the left, versus PC at max settings on the right. And just to be clear, the PC version is running at 1080p, which is a match for the Switch version, simply because my Elgato HD60 only goes up to 1080p, so if you're playing the PC version on a 4K monitor, it really looks great. I played it like that for a while myself, and it's a beautiful game. But what you'll notice here is that both versions look amazingly similar, but of course there are changes made, and some of you may have already spotted one or two, while others are hidden a bit better. Let's start with shadow resolution. When we're zooming around the track, it's often hard to notice, but if we stop under a swaying tree like this one, the difference becomes much more obvious. That being said, when I shared this shot on Twitter, no one seemed to notice the change in shadow quality down on the lower right-hand side, so maybe it's not that noticeable at all times. And while we're on this shot, I'd also like to touch on motion blur, because when you switch the camera from forward-facing to rear view, you get a single frame of motion blur, which is a great point of comparison. As you can see, we're getting fewer samples on the Switch, resulting in more noticeable banding as compared to the PC version at max settings. That being said, it's still a pretty high quality effect. Another quick look at shadows. As I'm sure you can imagine, as you're zooming around a course, it can be hard to spot the difference. Texture resolution also appears to be very comparable, though if you look closely, you'll notice nearer texture filtering along the ground in the Switch version. Next up, I thought we'd look at water, which actually looks identical between both versions. It isn't a horribly complex effect, but it works well. A water shader is applied to a flat surface in the case of smaller bodies of water, and an undulating surface for larger bodies like we see here. There are no screen space reflections or anything like that, just a more basic cube map. The bright side is the Switch has no problem matching the water from the PC version. The downside is instances like this, where you can look out over a body of water and see reflections of trees that clearly aren't there. While it certainly isn't realistic, it has a very pleasant aesthetic that honestly gives me some GameCube Wave Race Blue Storm vibes, so I'm a fan. Next up is frame rate, and this is something some of you may have noticed in that introductory gameplay. The original PC version ran at 60 frames per second, while the Switch version is dropped to 30. At this point, it's a change which Switch owners are very accustomed to. I'd also say that the motion blur we mentioned earlier does a surprisingly good job of smoothing out that lower frame rate. It doesn't look like 60, of course, but to my eyes it certainly seems smoother than I'm used to for 30 frames per second. Finally, one last change, and in my opinion the most noticeable, is draw distance on foliage and some other environmental details. You can see it in these trees as we come around the corner, and you'll notice it along the side of the road regularly as you race. It doesn't help that there's no sort of fade for this pop-in, it quite literally pops, which really draws your eye to it. This is one instance where I do wonder if the downgrade could have been handled better to make it a little less distracting. But before we finish up, I wanted to quickly return to performance to address one issue on the Switch version. Like I said, Rise runs at 30 frames per second on Switch, and in the 12 different courses we tested, we never saw it drop below that mark. We did, however, see it make some strange jumps above it. During about half the races, we saw the frame rate flutter between 30 and 35 frames per second. At first, I wondered if it was an issue with an encoder not playing nice with the frame rate tester, but the more I watched it, the more I became convinced this was an actual software issue. The oddest thing is that it will sometimes correct itself mid-race. Here we have lap 1 on the left and lap 2 on the right, and you'll notice that lap 2 is running at a flawless and smooth 30 frames per second, despite lap 1 exhibiting that odd fluttering. Now to be fair, I noticed none of this while I was actually playing, and was surprised to see anything other than a perfectly straight line when I fed it through the tester. For me, it had no negative impact on gameplay, but I could see those more in tune with frame rates picking up on it quicker. All that being said, Rise Race the Future is probably one of the best looking games on Switch. It holds up remarkably well to the PC version, and it also makes me suspect that the PS4 and Xbox One versions ought to be virtually identical to the PC release. I'll have a full review soon, but until then, if you enjoyed this video, give it a like and consider subscribing to Nintendo World Report TV. You can also check out NintendoWorldReport.com for a whole lot more, and if you want to chat with us, you can join our Discord. There's a link in the description. Stick around for info on our Patreon. Once again, I'm John Reardon, and I'll see you next time. This video is made possible by our generous supporters on Patreon. Did you know that Nintendo World Report is funded directly by fans like you? When you support Nintendo World Report on Patreon, you get immediate access to multiple exclusive podcasts every month, exclusive Discord channels, an early look at select content, and more, all for as little as $1 a month. Check out patreon.com/NWR for all the details.